Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. We got another It's Complicated channel video. This one's called Hoeflation. Sounds like it's going to be pretty spicy. Let's go and watch it together.
If prostitution was legal, do you think we'd have a better society?
Yes,
Why?
because you ain't got to be worried about the police coming after you if you want to buy some pussy.
You know, to answer the question, I tend to be pretty libertarian about that. I think if it's, people aren't coerced into doing it and it's something they voluntarily are consenting to do, then I'm fine with that. So I think people should have the right, even if it may not be like a healthy thing to engage in. What I relate this to is like pornography. I think pornography is not something a guy should look at. I don't think it helps you at all. I think it kind of warps your view on sex. Those are just my beliefs about it. But at the same time, I am still okay with it being legal if that's what people want to consume or even produce for that matter. So I believe in personal choice.
The men that come to Las Vegas and they think every woman prostitute. If you're out here in your dress, you're prostitute. So they treat you like trash. They talk to you like trash. They tell you trashy stuff because automatically you're a prostitute. So
The thing about, I guess, our culture, or at least what it used to be, is that prostitution has this very negative stigma around it, that the women who engage in it are lesser than, or they're just not good, or they're not, worth their trash, kind of like this lady says, or at least that's the fear. Would legalization help to fight some of those stigmas? Maybe.
absolutely not. No, it wouldn't.
I actually think it would solve a lot of society's problems. I know that sounds absolutely insane, but I do think it would be solving a lot of society's problems. It would be solving so much sex trafficking, male trafficking, child trafficking, so much things would actually be solved if this actually got legalized.
I think sex trafficking is generally the point that's brought up against the legalization of prostitution. I don't really know the specifics. I think generally, I think it's legal in some places in Europe. And there has been studies that I remember seeing a while back. And I think it said sex trafficking becomes an issue when a place legalizes it. And generally you're seeing people from places where it is illegal or just places with worse economies. And people are traveling from there to, these more thriving economies in Europe in order to engage in this work, to make money or whatever, that contributes to more sex trafficking. But if prostitution's legalized, I think it would be heavily, heavily regulated. And it's probably better if the women that are doing it can at least appeal to an authority if sex trafficking is something that's occurring, they should not have to fear possibly getting arrested for engaging with it. I'd like to think a lot of places are like that now. I don't know. Depending on how it's regulated, I think will determine a lot of that.
Personally, do I want to do it? I mean, no. But does it bring down the price? Does it bring down the value? It does. And it brings down the value on other women. And that's the problem. That's a solution. But with us, it's as men, we pay too much. We go through too much, and it's the truth.
When it comes to paying for it, you often hear things like all men pay. The difference between prostitution and going on a few dates with the woman or whatever it is that with prostitution you're paying a clearly defined price. So you know what you're going to pay for what. For dating someone, there's no guarantee. It's kind of more like a gamble versus a straightforward transaction. So you might go in there and do the whole rigmarole of a few dates and, nothing happens. And she's just there's no spark, would be better as friends and whatever. You spent some money, you know what I mean? And that sucks. You're not getting it back. With prostitution, if it was legalized and you walk into a brothel or something, I mean, you'd go in there and I guess see the menu, quote unquote. And if there's some kind of problem, then you don't spend your money and you just leave versus giving over your money and not getting it back or whatever.
Why is porn legal but prostitution isn't?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What's the difference between being paid for sex and being paid for sex in front of a camera?
Some way some company can own it, own the rights, and stream it the right way, and be able to, you know.
It is essentially prostitution. I mean, people are selling the sex act, and the difference is it's being put on camera and then you know, sent to the masses digitally or whatever. The real question I wonder is what would happen to porn consumption if prostitution was legalized. Would people buy it as much?
Why is it okay for you to be a porn star, but it's not okay for you to be a prostitute? I don't get that. Honestly, I don't.
If prostitution was legal, what do you think would happen to OnlyFans?
It would go down the drain. We wouldn't want to pay to see it if we could go get the real thing.
Do you believe that lonely, sexless men are more likely to be violent, and if so, why?
Yes, because they got a lot of pressure built up.
Like, if I got arrested tomorrow, God forbid, and I went to jail, and they throw me in the hold or whatever, and I look around and I see the other dudes that are in there, if I see like 10 incels, I'd be like, oh, thank God. I'd probably let out a sigh of relief. But if I saw like, the proverbial prison dude, if I saw like Tyrone in there, that one guy from Friday After Next, I'd be like, oh man, I'd be worried.
The most calmest ones, they sitting in the crib playing their video games, beating their meat, eating their Cheetos, just kicking it, being fat, cool guys at the crib, I'm just saying, I can't judge nobody, you feel me? Because, hey, I probably was that at one time,
So if prostitution was cheap and accessible, do you think there would be less sexual violence?
Yes.
If so, would you be in support of making that possible despite the fact that it objectifies women?
No.
Why?
Because.
Don't you want to live in a safer society?
Yeah.
The point of objectification is interesting. The irony of it is she says no to its legalization because the idea of objectification for women is a negative, at least from her point of view. The strange part about it is with pornography being legal, OnlyFans and all this stuff, objectification is already taken to such a high degree. I mean, I don't think legalizing prostitution would have that big of an impact on the current level of objectification of women. It might even lower the objectification of women, because if guys are in there and they can get that which they desire, then, they might be less likely to pay attention to ads and things that objectify women because they got their needs met.
But I wouldn't do it, but I mean, everybody can do their own thing, whatever.
I'm not saying you have to do it, but I'm just saying, why wouldn't you just support it being an option for men?
Most women don't like being considered prostitutes, so I think the labels kind of turn women off.
You have a lot of tension built up that you need to release sexually, and if you don't have a partner for that, or at least access to, some kind of open sexual relationship you can get into, then you're going to be probably more hostile and on edge, I believe.
And that goes into like if sex is a need or a want. The issue with prostitution is it's not the same as like having a genuine, you're not going to get intimacy from a prostitute, and I describe prostitution as using a human body to masturbate with. It's essentially what it is, right? And prostitution and pornography contributes to what I would call the compartmentalization of sex. So instead of sex being this thing where you're loving a person as a whole, and you guys are connected and on it, not just a physical but an emotional level, it's more so just a physical release that's meant for just one biological need in the person that doesn't account anything else, and the prostitute themselves, it's not like they like you. It's just, they're just doing this for the money, right? So it's just to satisfy a need, and it's not a genuine love. However, if sex is a need and someone is unable to get in a relationship or whatever the case is, and they're getting to a point where it's really frustrating, I would be okay with the option being open for that, because the current alternative is it leads to this desperation and frustration coming out in ways that aren't really particularly desirable. And people then get into relationships that might be really toxic because they're trying to satisfy this need, but they're bending over backwards to do it. And then maybe when they get the need satisfied, then they're just checked out of the relationship and nobody's happy.
So if prostitution was cheap and accessible, do you think there would be less sexual violence?
I do. Less sexual violence? Absolutely, 100%.
If so, would you be in support of making that possible despite the fact that it objectifies women?
I think that even if it was legal, it would still be their choice, so I don't think it objectifies women.
Hoeflation is a term which describes the increase in price men have to pay for lower value women. Men have more competition than ever, women have more options than ever. In essence, dating has now become a luxury commodity, and the only option is for men to step their game up. Why should men be expected to bring more to the table than they ever have in order to please women who bring less to the table than they ever have?
Because that's just how it is. I don't know. Men are supposed to be providers. If they have to bring more to the table, it's just because that's the society we live in today.
You know, the thing that always kind of gets me is, like she says, men are expected to be providers. But that is putting men in a traditional role, right? And our culture is kind of in this transition phase between traditionalism and whatever's coming next. And Hoeflation is happening because most of the women aren't being traditional, right? So they're not being traditional, yet they're expecting the men to be traditional, right? So it's like, I can get this on my own. I don't need you. However, I still want you to be a protector and provider, which is creating this horrible, horrible disconnect. The concept of Hoeflation is saying men have to work 20 times harder for women that are 20 times worse. But it's like, you know, people's grandma or whatever in the 50s would not be a hoe, you know, if they were fulfilling their traditional aspect, right? And then it makes sense to work for them. The problem now is we have this kind of blurred line that's not very well defined between people acting like traditional when they want to, but then not traditional when they want to also. So if men are brought up under the conditioning that you needed to be protectors and providers, and then they're then encountering women that are not fully traditional themselves, they're kind of in this place where they can be easily taken advantage of because they have needs that they can't get fulfilled.
Things cost more nowadays.
And how's that working out for us?
Barely.
It's not working out. I mean, the stats on marriage speak for themselves.
Why should men be expected to bring more to the table than they ever have in order to please women who bring less to the table than they ever have?
We shouldn't have to. I think women need to start lowering their standards and men need to start raising their standards, or we're just going to be sitting there. It's going to be a horrible society.
I don't even really view it as lowering standards. It's just accepting what you're willing to do and not to do. It's like if you're a woman, and if typically a woman who maybe makes more money than a guy doesn't want to marry a guy that makes less than them, even if he has a decent job and has his stuff together, it's not really lowering her standards. It's just accepting that you're not living traditionally, and you should not be so concerned with looking for a man who's living traditionally if you're not living traditionally. You know what I mean? And then on the other side, men need to accept that, hey, they're not living in that way, and this is what the new woman looks like. I need to adapt to this, meaning I don't have to pressure myself to be the protector and provider all the time. She's going to have to carry some of that load. It's an adjustment more so than like lowering standards.
If most men are average and women's standards are delusional, why isn't prostitution a more practical solution than telling men to all become high value?
Well, I mean, I think that is what, like, if you're a low value man and that's what you got to do, then yeah, I would, then, you know, resort to prostitution. But I feel like every man personally, you should work on yourself, you know, value yourself first. And then, you know, once you start chasing yourself, the women are going to chase you.
That's the accepted sort of philosophy or guidance and advice that's given nowadays, especially with all these YouTube podcasts and stuff. And, you know, it's about becoming high value, and then the women will be there, you know. But the truth is not all men can become high value, and we know this, right? The self-improvement narrative is pushed heavily, right? And if you're a guy and you engage in prostitution, again, there's a stigma with that. It's not just for the women. I mean, it's also for the men who would procure such services, and it's just like there's something wrong with you or whatever it is. But I don't know if participating in prostitution and self-improvement have to be this thing where, like, if a guy does that, suddenly he's never going to self-improve. He still has the choice to be like, that's not fulfilling for me. This isn't meaningful. I want something that's more meaningful. I want real intimacy, and I'm going to do what I can to get that. Again, for me, it's just about having the choice to do that, more so than saying if it's legalized, suddenly men will become these like gluttonous beasts, like in WALL-E or in that episode of Futurama where Fry gets that Lucy-Lou sex bot. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not like prostitutes are out here giving it for free. So most guys who can't afford that anyways aren't really going to be able to participate in prostitution unless they go out and ironically become productive and make money so they can afford that to begin with. So I think the self-improvement aspect still plays a role. And if prostitution is legalized, it's not going to get in the way of that.
If legalizing prostitution would be a game changer, why is it never talked about on any of these podcasts?
We're talking about it now.
It's like everybody like it, but ain't nobody gonna talk about it.
Because
that's such a good question. The podcasts basically, like Fresh and Fit or whatever, those kinds of people, it's mostly about the self-improvement. I mean, it's become a high-value man. That's the advice, and it's just not practical. But most of those podcasts have just become entertainment. I saw whatever podcast, and they had Candace Owens on there, who's, pretty hardcore traditional, right? And then they had actually 2 sex workers on there. And they were berating the sex workers pretty hard. It's like, that's the grift, right? It's like, bring on the sex workers and then bring on the traditional tradcon whoever, and then just dunk on these people and make a fool out of them. And then the audience eats that up. Like, the audience isn't even self-improving by watching that. They're just it's kind of a masturbatory high-value ritual. It's like, you're not high-value watching this, but if you can put yourself in the shoes of a high-value person that can then dunk on these ladies that have given you frustration or whatever. The podcasts are they're more so there to just shame guys into, going on the path of self-improvement. They don't really advocate for any legal changes, which is something to be questioned. I don't know why. Like that whatever podcast with Candace Owens, like they have 2 sex workers at the table that are clearly not being trafficked. They're like, we find meaning in this. This is what we do. Yet they never had the conversation about if it should be legalized or not. It's like, why not talk about if that would help men or not help men? However you feel about it. It is kind of weird. They don't really talk about it.
they look at prostitutes as disgusting, horrible women, and they think of us as the very bare minimum. If you're a prostitute, you don't have nothing to offer.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe people just scared of the subject. They probably not ready for it yet.
People are scared of the subject because you will not look cool advocating for prostitution. Let's just be honest. Andrew Tate, who ironically, did a bunch of webcam work and made a lot of money off this kind of stuff, is cool because chicks like him and everybody wants to be that guy where chicks like him and he doesn't have to pay to get it. It's like the body count question's a good one, right? Like typically if a woman has a high body count, she's shamed for it, right? And if men have a high body count, they're like a player. Like if you meet a guy and he's like, he slept with a bunch of women, you're like, what is this guy doing? Like how did he figure that out? And then people want to listen to him and they're celebrated. But if you put two guys right next to each other and one guy has a body count from seducing women, and another guy has a body count from paying prostitutes, people are going to look at the guy that paid prostitutes and be like, oh, that's what you meant by body count. Like you got no game or whatever it is. There's a shame that our culture has around that, basically. And I think it ultimately has to do with how we view sex. Trying to become a high value man and reinforcing traditional values is not going to save us, because our laws, the way they're constructed now, does not help you live a traditional life. If anything, you're just a lamb getting fattened for the slaughter for the family law courts to eat up.
Could it be because they're pushing their own conservative agenda?
Yes.
These guys, they push their conservatism agenda so much. Like Andrew Tate, for instance, he pushes that shit. He pushes it all the way. And when you do it all the way, you kind of got to, you know, disagree with prostitution being illegal because that's a libertarian, that's a liberal thing.
These guys are right? It goes back to the tradcons, you know, basically hijacking what was essentially the men's movement, right? The men's movement went from pickup artistry and game, and it's now become like red pill and becoming a high value. It's become mainstream. A lot of their talking points are around now. I think the tradcon camp see this, the Daily Wire people see this, and they're trying to get the attention of those men who gravitate towards that. The ironic thing about this is they do not have a solution to the problem, right? Andrew Tate does not have a solution. His solution is to become religious and traditional. That's fine, but we know it won't work here in America for one obvious reason, because he had to move away from here. He had to go somewhere where the laws actually would reinforce traditional values. Since our laws do not reinforce that, the tradcon approach cannot work. And for some reason, the tradcons aren't out here advocating for changing the laws. You know what I mean? Like, they're not advocating for putting laws in place to get rid of paternity fraud. It was the tradcon who signed in no-fault divorce in the Governor Ronald Reagan, 1969, I believe, in Sacramento, where I'm sitting right now because I live in Sacramento, signed the first no-fault divorce bill, you know, here in California, and that paved the way for marriage and divorce to become what it is today. They want you to be traditional, yet they've handicapped you in every way that would allow you to be traditional.
Do you think the solution could be prostitution, the world's oldest institution?
I think that you should have the right to do with what you want with your body, whether that's prostitution, you know, abortion, whatever it is. I think that, you know, to a certain extent, you should have, as long as it doesn't harm other human beings, then you should have rights to do whatever you want with your body.
You know, and I agree with that. That's very libertarian. It's for me, it's about choice, and I think that connects well with American values, typically freedom, right? And of course, responsibility goes along with that. You know, well, is prostitution the solution? I think it's one aspect of the solution. I think the other aspect is reforming family law. You know, changing the way child support and spousal support work in this country, changing the way paternity laws work in this country. I think all of those together are the solution, you know, actually.
Why is my body, my choice acceptable when it comes to abortion, but not when it comes to prostitution, the draft, or vaccine mandates?
Control, man. Just control. You know, I'm not like a conspiracy theorist or anything, but you know, like, there's a deeper purpose behind things. You know, they try to get us to fall in line, you know, at least to some extent, if it's going to line their pockets. And if it's not lining their agenda and it's not lining their pockets, then they're not going to back it, you know. And eventually one day when they can figure out a way for it to line their pockets, you know, it will be legal, you know, and they'll all act like they never were against it.
That guy's bringing up a really, really good point, you know, and it kind of reminds me of weed, right? Like, you know, weed was illegal for so long, and now it's legal. I mean, especially here in California where I live, and you see big businesses is in it. Like, they're on it. It's regulated a lot. I mean, you know, if you want to have a dispensary, there's a lot of laws you have to follow. It's taxed pretty high. You know, I imagine if prostitution was legalized, it'd probably be a similar situation. I love the my body, my choice question, you know, and I talk a lot about the draft, right? It's like, could you imagine if a draft occurred and a bunch of guys came out with signs that said, my body, my choice, you know, we will not go. We don't want to fight for this country. That would be a freaking disaster, wouldn't it? And it's like, well, why don't you want to fight for the country? They'd be like, I don't know. Houses are too expensive to buy. Medical insurance is too much. The medical bill. I went to the ER once and the ambulance ride just put me in debt. I can't find someone to get married. The family law court screwed me over. They'd be able to give a lot of reasons why they don't want to. The war will come. This gravy train cannot keep going. Eventually, the people at the top will decide to cash in their chips. And their chips are all the men here that they can use to throw out in the fields. You know what I mean? To advance whatever their interest is. So it will happen someday. And when that happens, will men be ready to take up arms? Will they feel like patriots on the inside, or will they say, my body, my choice? And we have like the biggest disaster ever.
Wouldn't it end simping and shift the sexual marketplace to where women would have to compete for the men?
Yes, it would actually. It would very much so, because it would make it more accessible for men to get what they need.
I don't know if it would end simping, but it would shift the marketplace.
You know, in some areas when you got like a lot of prostitutes in the corner, they kind of be, you know, in competition for the next, you know, the next big baller and all of that. So it's already kind of women in competition.
People might be willing to spend less on some woman's OnlyFans if they can get their needs met somewhere else for a price that makes sense. So I don't know if it would end simping, but I think it would definitely lessen simping to some extent. I mean, if a guy goes and gets his needs taken care of, he might come home and be like, you know, I don't want to spend the money on OnlyFans today, and I don't want to put up with this person's BS or something like that. So I think it would have an impact on simping.
Why should men pay for the opportunity to maybe get sex instead of just paying for sex?
Why not just pay for the sex? Why get a maybe?
If you really love this woman, if you really like this woman, this is really what you want, I think you should, you know, put the money into it and put the time into it. However, if it's just meaningless sex, or if it's just, you know, a conversation and it leads to sex, and whatever, you end up buying drinks and shit, I mean, it ain't worth it.
It goes back to choice. You know, if you're in a situation where you're having trouble with that, getting your needs met somewhere is okay, but that's not going to take care of the intimacy needs. So you might have a guy who can't figure it out with women, and he goes and gets his biological needs met. He's going to come out of that, and there's still going to be that emptiness there where you're looking for a meaningful relationship with someone, and that's something only like, you know, a wife or a girlfriend or whatever can provide for you. So we have to be honest about that.
Shouldn't relationships be built on love rather than sex and manipulation?
Yes, relationships should be built on love and respect. 100%.
If the needs have an avenue to be met, will the relationships that people then do decide to get into be more genuine?
It revolves around manipulation. We read books. Men read books. Neil Strauss. You know, all these books about game, in the sense that we're trying to gain game and manipulate women to have sex, when in reality, we don't even want the love. We just want the sex.
You know, when I think of game, it's really just for someone to purport that they're high value instead of actually being high value. If you're high value and the women just come to you, do you really need game to get them so much if a bunch of groupies are just throwing themselves at you versus someone who is more of a normal guy? Then game really makes a lot more sense. But this is getting kind of long. I think that's a great question to leave this on. There's still another 5 or 6 minutes to this episode, so if you guys might want to head over to It's Complicated channel and check this one out. You know, it's an interesting subject to think about. I appreciate that he's brought it up. I think it's something that definitely should be discussed, and I'm interested to hear what people have to say about it. From the religious tradcon angle, like, you know, obviously it's sex outside of marriage for them is always going to be sinful. So they're more about keeping it illegal. However, at the same time, the institution of marriage itself has been, you know, effectively neutered, right? And all these laws have changed to really make it tougher for people in marriages, you know, and the culture kind of is not helping keep marriages together currently. So on the one hand, they want this to be illegal, but then they're not advocating for changing any of these marriage laws. So the way I see it is we'll then legalize it and give these guys who are left out in the cold an option to at least get something, you know. And right now would probably be the ripest time to do that. There was that study that came out that said a third of men, 30% of men or something from like 18 to 29 have not had sex in the last year. We've got more male virgins than ever, right? We have this huge contingent of society that it's kind of building up, you know what I mean? And taking away any avenues from these guys might not be a good thing. So legalizing it might help them, you know. Anyways, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Let me know what you think down below, and we'll see you on the next one.